Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time, all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking Reflections, the world's #1 most popular poetry analysis podcast, and I am one of your co-hosts, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And we are here on day 2 of poems for reflections and moments of spring forward for like a space for thoughts, and I don't know, whatever poems bring to mind, I suppose. But we're kind of in the spirit of what we did last year, where we talked about haiku in little mini episodes for a whole week. We're doing something similar here. Rather than focusing on a genre, given the craziness of everything right now, we're sort of using the space to focus on short poems that perhaps bring us out of brooding and into a not shallower but a gentler place of reflection. As always, before we get into it, if you could give us a rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts and review, it helps us defeat the ever-powerful algorithm and helps us find new listeners, and it means a lot. It cheers us up, and we thank you. This poem is one of my favorites. I think we've referenced Gwendolyn Brooks, but I don't know if we've ever talked about a Brooks poem at length. We've talked about a couple of hers in reference to the poems that we were focusing on,
And we did do Joy Harjo's Golden Shovel poem. That's probably the closest.
That's true. Yes, we did. We did do that. And yeah, and this is one of her poems. It's called A Lovely Love, and it is about love, as the title would indicate. But sometimes I read titles and I'm like, okay, let's read the poem, and then I realize I should have had the title in mind when I'm listening to it. And I think this is one of those poems. Okay. A Lovely Love. Let it be alleys. Let it be a hall whose janitor javelins epithet and thought to cheapen hyacinth darkness that we sought and played we found, rot, make the petals fall. Let it be stairways and a splintery box where you have thrown me, scraped me with your kiss, have honed me, have released me after this cavern kindness, smiled away our shocks. That is the birthright of our lovely love in swaddling clothes. Not like that other one, not lit by any fondling star above, not found by any wise men either. Run. People are coming. They must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere.
This is one of those ones where I get that poem feeling at the end, which we have discussed, that sort of nebulous, like, whoosh.
Yeah.
This one always does that for me.
I know. I love the ending so much. It's like so cool. Yeah, run. People are coming. They must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere. It's just like, damn. Yeah, and this is a short one, but it still might, there's some denser parts, so I think it might still help to do a little just kind of run down. But it's called A Lovely Love, and there's this kind of refrain of let it be alleys, let it be a hall, and the it by the end sort of becomes clear as like the love, I think, like let us it. And so the poem, I think, is like, how do we define this love that we have? What are ways that we can describe it? And so it's basically different ways of doing that: alleys, a hall, stairways, a splintery box. And then there's this ending that's kind of like people are coming. They can't catch us here, like in our love, basically. So there's a kind of forbiddenness in it too. But that's kind of the very basic, like, sort of what's happening in the poem.
Definitely. And along with that, as you were saying, for being a poem that's important to keep the title in mind with, the it becomes clear it's the love, but also implicitly it is a lovely love, and it's even called out as that a little bit after the midway point of the poem, and particularly because so many of the descriptions for it are kind of unexpectedly harsh, maybe in light of the title, to have the it be not just love, but to be mindful of the fact that it's being called a lovely love sort of creates an interesting tension that runs through the poem as well.
Right. That's such a good point. Yeah, because, it's not like roses or like a bed of a meadow flow, or like, a beautiful babbling brook, or, there's a lot of kind of more glamorous associations or images that one could associate with their lovely love, but instead they're actually pretty markedly both like kind of everyday, but also like run down and broken in certain ways. So like let it be alleys is the first one, and then let it be a hall, and of course it could be a hall like a grand hall, but immediately we get the janitor of the hall, so I'm sort of thinking of like a public school hall or something like that.
Same.
And then it's like let it be stairways and a splintery box, so it's not even like a nice box. It like you don't really want to open it because yeah. And then like have released me after this cavern kindness. So there's actually one, like, yeah, to your point, it is, I hadn't actually thought of that. It's really true that one, without the kind of lovely, you could read this poem as like, oy, they seem like they're in kind of a, like they're in love, but maybe it's not really a healthy relationship, or something like that. But rather, I think the poem seems to be like, I don't know, it's doing a lot of interesting, complicated things. One is, I think, simply that there is a loveliness to these places in some kind of way, that the speaker is like, we don't need roses for this love, like it's in alleys, it's in a hall, it's in a splintery box. Um, the other thing, which is kind of um, more complex, and I'm curious what you think about it, is like, and it really comes out at this end line, which is so great, but like, they must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere, which is like um so fascinating because we've been the whole poem has been kind of trying to find a definition for what the love is, and then at the end it's like definitionless, but there's the strictness, and that kind of, when you think back to like, okay, all these different images, they're all kind of containers that are pretty, like, you have an alley, which is often pretty narrow, a hallway, the box, and it's like the box where you have thrown me, there's a cavern kindness. So the speaker and the love are kind of like captured within it. And I think it's, and this is where it gets complicated, because on the one hand it's a lovely love, but then on the other hand there is a kind of violence that's described, so like a splintery box where you have thrown me, scraped me with your kiss, honed me, and then smiled away our shocks, and then in the hall it's the janitor, and this is like, the sounds are so in the beginning like dense that it's often hard for me to even like, and it's pretty abstract, but it's like, whose janitor javelins epithet and thought to cheapen hyacinth darkness that we sought. So there's like a javelin, like a janitor throwing javelins that are like epithets, kind of, I don't know, derogatory language or something potentially. And yeah, I don't know. So it's like, yeah, there's just a lot happening there. But at the same time, yeah, anyway, those were kind of like a lot of the beginning thoughts that I had about this poem.
I'm particularly attuned to the violence which you had mentioned, because that's also something that I think when you hear a lovely love, aside from all of the various kinds of romantic stereotypical descriptions you expect of the scene, you also expect a certain kind of like bodily sensuality that's gentle, and intimate, and you don't necessarily get that except for scraped me with your kiss, and like scrapes are bloody and kind of violent, and there's this splintery box where you might prick yourself. um, but along with that, I also really liked your point of how many of the spaces that are described are like containers, and it feels to me like those two parts kind of intersect, because this really lavish idea of idealized romantic relationship and love can feel very restrictive, and in fact can feel like it is not just confining but injurious to your mental well-being when you're in a relationship, because either you or the other person might have all these ideas about what goes along with it and the way it should be versus the way it is. And some of what I see in the line, "This is the birthright of our lovely love," coming right after the most intense, like, "You have thrown me, scraped me with your kiss, honed me, have released me after this cavern kindness, smiled away our shocks," like some of the most intense and visceral, like personal language, is like, actually that part of relationships is also a big part of what a truly lovely love is. It is a love that is big enough to encompass not just the good parts, basically, but it should encompass challenge, and it should encompass hardship and obstacles, and be able to find a way through and around them, because the partners are sort of understanding that that's also not just part of what love can be, but really where it is of the greatest value, because it is about that. And then uh, that last part, run, people are coming, they must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere, I see also as like kind of writing against strict definitions of what love should be, what love is supposed to be. It is an argument for being definitionless because, in fact, in being definitionless, you can be so much more, but that there are forces that want to try and put you back into a splintery box. Uh, there are janitors who are out there trying to clean up these hallways where you're trying to create messy complexity, you know? Um, I feel like that's sort of what I carry through the poem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, it is like I really like what you're saying about that, because there's like, especially with things like love that are, you know, um for good reason, like talked about everywhere and always come up, and there's like so many different like layers of pressure around it, and so many like, different kinds of ways, from like, I don't know, gender norms, sexuality norms, like race, class, political, just like kids in love versus adults in love, and all these kinds of things. And like it's and it's also something that, because it sort of captures our imaginative um like sort of center a lot of the time, we've put a lot of meaning onto it, and um like a lot of times, both in life and in, like your average kind of relationship, and in a TV show or a book or something, I feel like a lot of times the conflict is about competing ideas of love. Like, this is what I think a relationship is, and this is what you think a relationship is, and we're not seeing, um and anyway, which is all to say, it can get very strict in a lot of different ways, and yet it's something that's so, nebulous and different in every given circumstance. Um and yeah, and like, yeah, the the kind of part that made it a poem that, like, my personal nerd self was like, oh my god, this poem is so good, is that it's a sonnet. Okay, so it's got 14 lines, and this one is actually a pretty traditional sonnet in a lot of ways. It's, written contemporary, but it follows like a very strict rhyme scheme. You know, like hall rhymes with fall, thought rhymes with sought, box, shocks, kiss, this, love, above, one, run, here, atmosphere. It's like ABBA kind of, and it has a very traditional sonnet structure. It has 14 lines, and then, after the eighth line, there's the volta, or the turn. Like, as Jack was saying, after this really intense visceral part, Cavern, kindness, smiled away our shocks. That's the eighth line, and then that is the birthright of our lovely love. And that's like such a clear turn in the poem that sort of follows us. And then it even has a kind of like Shakespearean style couplet at the end, where it's like, run, like people are coming, they must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere. That almost like, in like, a lot of times I feel like in Shakespeare's sonnets there's a kind of summing up of an argument that's been sort of around in the sonnet. So it follows all the like rules of a sonnet in a time when, it's not Petrarch's time, it's not Shakespeare's time. Like it's a choice to, and if you read, like Brooks's other sonnets, like the rights for Cousin Vit, um, she does not like, she loves to mess with the form, even as she follows it. And so it's definitely a deliberate choice to do that. And it made me realize that um, the poem, and sonnet is the traditional love poem, but it's like a strict sonnet, and I feel like there's a kind of meta thing happening where the speaker is like trapped in this love, but also trapped in this sonnet, basically, where in the same way that a hall or an alley or the box could be a container for one's love, the sonnet can also be that container. And in the way that, like, the poem has so kind of deliberately made the sonnet as like loud as possible, like a lot of times we talk about if a form is loud or quiet, if it's calling attention to itself, by using the kind of like direct end rhymes in the rhyme scheme, especially that it's like, I'm a sonnet. And by doing that, it's like also, it makes it more apparent that the speaker is like trapped within it, that there are edges and boundaries to what constitutes a sonnet and what isn't. And so in a certain way, the sonnet is also a strict atmosphere, I guess. But within that, it's like you know definitionless, right? It's there's a million sonnets, and they manage to cover a lot of ground within the tight space.
But they are
And
also like the main tradition of sonnets that anybody is gonna come across is gonna be Petrarch, who's like hung up on the same woman he saw one time for his entire life.
yeah,
Like that's his whole deal. So okay.
yeah,
And then Shakespeare, who is both inspired by and writing sort of through that tradition, and in some ways against it. He's doing more complicated things. But like a lot of the Shakespearean sonnets are also on the subject of love. So it's interesting also to have this not just in that form tradition on its surface and like being part of it in this explicit way through the louder form, but again, like calling attention to the form also in some ways calls attention to that strain of the sonnet tradition.
yeah, exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. And yeah, I just, from a like just poetry nerd perspective, I'm like, oh my god, that's so cool. It's like, it also, like, I've loved this poem for a long time, but then I was just kind of thinking about it again, and initially the connection might just be a little surface level, but um I myself am sometimes feeling a little trapped in my own home. And I think there's a new level of strictness that's been imposed by the virus. Um, and it's not necessarily to do with love, but it certainly affected, like, relationships. I don't know. I started thinking, like, there's a couple ways to think about it, but I don't know. I was like, okay, well, I am in this place and I am, you know, trapped in some kind of way. And yet, like, here's this poem that is also trapped, and it's doing like all of this wonderful, it's expressing so much, like such a complicated love, I really think. And, you know, and the yesterday we talked about the pound, Mediterranean March, black cat on a quince branch, mousing blossoms. And we were, like you had talked about how much is captured even within those last two words of like mousing blossoms. And this is sort of a personal aside, but maybe it'll connect. But I hopped on the sourdough trend, and I've never made sourdough, and it's a quite insanely elaborate process that involves many steps of doing something for 2 minutes and then letting it sit for 6 hours or whatever. But I had some friends who were also doing it, and we had this, sort of like Zoom, like as we were all doing the steps, we would hang out, which is just to say it was like kind of a moment for me where I was like, there's a lot here where I am, and I can be resourceful potentially. And to be clear, a lot of times I'm not being resourceful, and I'm not one of those people who are like, we should be as productive as possible during this time. But like, in terms of like reorienting myself to the space that I am in, even if it's like not the one that even though it's not like ideal in a lot of ways and is very strict, there's ways that I'm trying to start to find to like make space and to like write against the kind of idea that I have about it right now, which is just like, this sucks and I'm trapped. And rather be like, this is definitionless, really. And there's like a lot of ways to be still. Yeah.
Definitionless in a strict atmosphere.
There you go.
That's real.
Yeah. And one of those things is I still have my poems, and I can share them with you all. I can talk about them with you, Jack. And, it's the imagination can really make a lot of space sometimes.
Absolutely. I think that's really lovely.
Should we read it again?
Let's do it.
A Lovely Love by Gwendolyn Brooks. Let it be alleys. Let it be a hall whose janitor javelins epithet and thought to cheapen hyacinth darkness that we sought and played we found. Rot, make the petals fall. Let it be stairways, and a splintery box where you have thrown me, scraped me with your kiss, have honed me, have released me after this cavern kindness smiled away our shocks. That is the birthright of our lovely love in swaddling clothes. Not like that other one, not lit by any fondling star above, not found by any wise men either. Run. People are coming. They must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena.
Woo woo!
Woo!
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.